Greetings, deep divers, and welcome. Today, we are jumping into a world that is, well, it's deceptively complex. The inner life of plants.
It really is.
I mean, if you've ever thought of plants as just sort of passive green things, this deep dive is going to be a total reality check for you.
Yeah, the mission today is pretty clear. We're giving you a shortcut, really, into the core of plant signal processing. We're talking about how they sense the world, how they decide, and how they respond.
It's all about communication.
Exactly. We're unpacking the cellular and chemical chatter that turns, a seemingly inert organism into this constantly calculating machine.
I love that phrase, constantly calculating. It just completely flips that old static image on its head. Because we see the slow changes, but plants are sensing everything all the time. I was looking at the date on sunflowers. They track the sun all day, which is amazing. But then
Oh, this is the best part.
at night, they completely reverse direction. They turn all the way back to face east, just waiting for the sun to rise.
That kind of precision, it requires a constant stream of information. Light, gravity, temperature, pathogens, wind, you name it. And it has to integrate all of that with its own internal chemical signals.
And what's really fascinating to me is that the basic system they use, the signal transduction, it's the same fundamental process we see in animals.
It's a universal language of cells.
Okay, so let's unpack that, this three-stage process.
Right, so it breaks down into 3 key steps. Number 1 is reception. That's where a specific receptor detects a stimulus.
Like an antenna.
Exactly. Then comes number 2, transduction. This is where the signal gets amplified and passed along inside the cell.
And finally,
Number 3, the response. This is where the cell's activity actually, fundamentally changes because of that signal.
to make this less abstract, let's use a really classic example. The potato you forgot about in a door cupboard.
Ah, yes, the etiolated potato sprout.
Exactly. When you finally find it, the shoots are all pale, super long, and spindly. It's basically doing one thing, growing up as fast as it can to find light. That's etiolation.
Right. It has these tiny, unexpanded leaves, short roots, a pale stem, because things like chlorophyll are a total waste of energy when you're underground.
But the second that shoot breaks through the soil and hits the light, everything changes. It undergoes this massive, rapid transformation called de-etiolation.
Or greening, yeah.
Right.
The stem stops getting longer, the leaves suddenly expand, the whole thing turns green, and the roots start growing properly.
That instantaneous switch is a perfect example of signal transduction.
Mm.
So let's walk through it. How does that first ray of light kick everything off?
It all starts with reception. So the light signal is detected by a photoreceptor protein called phytochrome.
Okay.
And what's interesting about this particular receptor is where it is. It's not on the cell membrane like a lot of receptors are. It's just floating around in the cytoplasm.
So how did scientists even figure out that this one specific protein was the key, the light switch, basically?
Through some really elegant studies on mutants, they looked at a tomato strain called the Aurea mutant. Aurea means gold.
Because it couldn't turn fully green.
Exactly. It looked yellowish. And they found these plants had way less functional phytochrome. So they did the key experiment. They injected working phytochrome back into the mutant cells.
And it greened up properly.
It did. That proved phytochrome was the sensor they were looking for.
Okay, so phytochrome catches the light. But sometimes that signal's incredibly weak, right? Like even a little moonlight can be enough.
Yes.
So how does the plant turn that tiny whisper of a signal into a huge system-wide command?
That is where transduction and amplification come in. This is the job of second messengers.
So these are like internal amplifiers.
Perfect way to think of it. They're small molecules or ions that relay and magnify the signal from that first receptor to all the proteins that need to respond.
And for greening, which ones are the most important?
2 are absolutely critical. First, you have calcium ions, K2+. When light activates phytochrome, it throws open these calcium channels, and you get this massive but very brief 100-fold surge of calcium in the cell.
Wow, 100-fold.
Yeah.
That's the first wave of amplification. What's the second molecule?
That would be cyclic GMP or cGMP. Phytochrome activation also kicks on an enzyme that starts cranking out cGMP. And what's so cool here is that you need both. It's not one or the other. If you just inject cGMP into a cell, you only get a partial greening response. You need the calcium surge, too.
It's like a two-key system. Okay, so we've got the signal, it's been amplified. Now for the response. What is actually happening inside the cell to make it green?
The second messengers trigger two main routes. The first one is super fast. It's called post-translational modification.
Okay, what does that mean in simple terms?
Think of it like a domino rally or a phone tree. The second messengers switch on enzymes called protein kinases, and a kinase's job is to add a phosphate group onto another protein, which activates it.
So kinase A turns on kinase B, which turns on kinase C.
Exactly. It's a cascade that very rapidly connects that first light signal to the final response. It ends up activating these proteins called transcription factors.
And there has to be an off switch, right, to keep it all in balance.
There does. And those are the protein phosphatases. Their job is to remove the phosphate groups and turn the pathway off. A cell is always in this dynamic balance between kinases turning things on and phosphatases turning them off.
So the second route, transcriptional regulation, that's what those activated transcription factors do next.
Precisely. They travel into the nucleus, they bind to specific parts of the DNA, and they act like switches to either increase or decrease the production of certain mRNAs.
So for dethylation, they're flipping the on switch for genes that make chlorophyll and all the machinery for photosynthesis.
You got it.
All right, so that's a single cell. But how does an entire plant coordinate everything? Growth, timing. That has to involve messages that can travel, right?
Yes, and that brings us to the plant hormones.
Chemical messenger.
Or growth regulators, yeah. They are active at incredibly low concentrations, and a key thing to remember is that it's rarely one hormone acting alone. It's almost always the ratio between two or more hormones that dictates what happens.
The first one ever discovered was auxin, and its story is tied to this great mystery, phototropism. Why plants bend towards light.
This goes way back to Charles and Francis Darwin in the 1880s. They showed that the very, very tip of the growing shoot was what sends the light, but the bending itself happened way further down.
So the signal had to be traveling.
It had to be. And then a researcher named Peter Boysen-Jensen proved it was a chemical. He cut the tip, put a block of permeable gelatin in between, and the shoot still bent.
Because the chemical could get through?
Yep. But when he used a piece of impermeable mica, the bending stopped. The signal was blocked. It had to be a substance.
And that substance was auxin. How does it move?
Its transport is really unique. It's called polar transport, meaning it only moves in one direction, from the tip downwards to the base. Special proteins located only on the bottom of each cell act like one-way gates.
And its main job in a young stem is what?
Cell elongation. This is the famous acid growth hypothesis. Auxin turns on proton pumps that acidify the cell wall. This acidic environment activates enzymes called expansins that basically loosen the wall's fabric.
So the cell wall gets stretchy.
It gets stretchy, and then the cell's internal water pressure, the turgor, can push it to expand and get longer.
Very clever.
Okay.
Next up, cytokinins. They mostly come up from the roots, and they work really closely with auxin.
It's all about the ratio again. In general, a high ratio of cytokinin to auxin promotes shoot growth. Flip that, a high auxin to cytokinin ratio, and you get root formation. This hormonal tug-of-war is perfectly illustrated by apical dominance.
Apical dominance. That's why pine trees have that classic pointy shape, right? The top bud grows and the side ones don't.
Exactly. Auxin flows down from that top or apical bud, and it inhibits the growth of the side buds near it. It does this partly by telling the plant to make other hormones called strigolactones, which are the direct off switch for those buds.
But the cytokinins from the roots are pushing back.
Right, they're flowing up and encouraging those side buds to grow. So the further down the stem you go, away from the auxin source, the more the cytokinins win out and you get branching.
Okay, let's talk gibberellins, or GA.
Yeah.
These are famous for causing really rapid stem elongation, right? Like bolting in lettuce.
Yes, and they have some fantastic commercial uses. They spray them on Thompson seedless grapes.
Well, why?
It makes the grapes themselves get bigger, and it also makes the stems between the grapes elongate, which lets more air circulate and cuts down on mold.
And they're also super important for getting seeds started.
Crucial. After a seed soaks up water, it releases GA, which signals the outer layer of the seed to start making digestive enzymes. These enzymes then break down all the stored starch into sugars for the growing embryo.
So GA is the go signal. What's the stop signal?
That would be the classic growth inhibitor, abscisic acid or ABA.
The survival manager.
That's a great term for it. ABA is all about slowing things down. First, it enforces seed dormancy. It keeps the seed from sprouting at the wrong time. In desert plants, for example, the seeds won't germinate until a heavy rain literally washes the ABA away.
And its other big role?
Drought tolerance. When a plant starts to wilt, ABA levels shoot up in the leaves. It acts on the guard cells around the stomata, the pores in the leaf, and causes them to close tight.
How does it do that?
It messes with their potassium ion channels. Potassium floods out of the guard cells, water follows by osmosis, the cells go limp, and the pore closes. It's a critical, immediate way to stop water loss.
And our last hormone, the gaseous one, ethylene.
Often called the stress hormone. So imagine a seedling trying to grow up through the soil and it hits a rock. Ethylene triggers something called the triple response.
Okay, what are the 3 parts?
1, stem elongation slows down. 2, the stem thickens to get stronger. And 3, it starts growing horizontally to try and get around the obstacle.
And we know how this pathway works because of another mutant, right? The Cytokinins mutant.
Yes, the constitutive triple response mutant. It does the triple response all the time, even with no ethylene around.
So something's stuck in the on position.
Exactly. The SICTR gene normally makes a protein that's a negative regulator and off switch. When that gene is broken, the pathway is permanently on.
Ethylene also famously triggers fruit ripening.
Yes, that chain reaction of softening, sweetening, color changes, and also abscission, which is leaf drop in the fall. It's all controlled by the shifting ratio of ethylene to auxin.
Speaking of seasons, let's circle back to light, and specifically to the phytochromes that we mentioned earlier.
Right, the red light sensors. They are masters of seasonal timing, acting as this really elegant molecular switch.
And the switch has 2 forms.
2 interchangeable forms. You have PR, which is the inactive form. It absorbs red light, and when it does, it rapidly converts to PFR, the active form.
And PFR absorbs far red light and switches back to PR.
You got it. So the plant state is basically determined by whatever kind of light it saw last. Remember that classic germination experiment? If the last flash of light a seed saw was red, it germinated because PFR was active. If the last flash was far red...
No germination. The switch was on.
Precisely. And this PFR to PR ratio is absolutely critical for shade avoidance.
Okay, how does that work?
Well, under a big tree canopy, the chlorophyll in the leaves above absorbs most of the red light, but the far red light gets through. So a plant in the shade is bathed in far red light.
Which pushes the switch over to the inactive PR form.
Yes. And the plant interprets that high level of PR as a signal for shade, and its immediate response is to pour all its energy into growing taller, to try and get out of the shadow.
And this light switch also helps the plant keep time.
Absolutely. It's the key to circadian rhythms. Plants have these internal 24-hour clocks that drive daily cycles, like the leaf movements of a bean plant.
But the clock isn't perfect, is it?
No, it's usually a bit off, maybe 21 or 27 hours. It's what we call a free-running period. But every single morning, the red light of dawn hits that phytochrome switch and entrains it. It resets the clock to exactly 24 hours.
And this timing is the basis for photoperiodism, right?
Yeah.
How plants flower at the right time of year.
Yeah.
And the key discovery was that plants are measuring the length of the night, not the day.
Yes. This led to the idea of a critical night length. So short day plants, like chrysanthemums, they need a night that is longer than some critical minimum to flower.
And if you interrupt that long night, even with just a quick flash of light...
No flowers. You've broken the dark, period.
And the opposite is true for long day plants, like spinach. They need a night that's shorter than a critical maximum. So interrupting a long night actually makes them flower.
Correct. And this flowering signal, which for decades was just this hypothetical thing called florigen, is detected in the leaves but has to travel to the buds. We now know it's a protein, the FT protein, that moves through the phloem to the tip of the shoot and says, okay, time to make flowers.
Amazing. Okay, let's move away from light. How do plants sense gravity? Gravitropism.
This is the statolic hypothesis. Think of it like little dense pebbles inside a cell. Plants have these specialized plastids full of starch called statoliths, mostly in the root cap.
And they just settle.
They just settle to the lowest point of the cell because of gravity. And that physical settling is the signal.
What does that signal trigger?
A redistribution of auxin. In a root, the auxin builds up on the lower side, and for roots, high auxin actually inhibits cell elongation. So the top side keeps growing normally while the bottom side slows down, causing the root to curve downwards.
And shoots do the reverse.
The exact reverse. Higher auxin on the lower side of a shoot promotes elongation, making it curved up, away from gravity.
Plants also respond to touch.
They do. There's thigmomorphogenesis, which is just changes in shape from constant stress, like wind making a tree shorter and stockier. And then there's thigmotropism, which is directional growth, like a vine's tendril coiling around a support.
And some plants move fast. The sensitive plant, Mimosa pudica, you touch it and the leaves just collapse.
That's all about a rapid loss of water pressure. Specialized motor cells called pulvini at the base of the leaflets instantly pump out potassium ions. Water follows, the cells go limp, and the whole structure folds up.
And this signal that tells them to do that travels via action potentials.
It does. Electrical impulses. I mean, they're thousands of times slower than our nerve impulses, but it's still electricity. It's just mind-blowing.
It really is. Okay, what about other environmental stresses, like a flood?
If a plant's roots are flooded, they're deprived of oxygen. This triggers ethylene production, which causes programmed cell death in parts of the root, creating these hollow air tubes.
Like little snorkels.
Exactly, to get oxygen from the air down to the submerged parts.
And extreme temperatures.
For heat stress, they produce heat shock proteins that act like chaperones to protect other proteins from falling apart. For cold stress, they do something really clever. They change the fats in their cell membranes.
How so?
They increase the amount of unsaturated fatty acids. Unsaturated fats are kinked, so they don't pack together tightly. This keeps the membranes fluid, like olive oil, instead of solidifying like cold butter.
So smart.
Yeah.
Okay, finally, let's talk defense systems, starting with pathogens.
The first line is PMP triggered immunity, or PTI. Plants can recognize general molecular patterns that are common to many pathogens. We call them PMPs. Think of it like recognizing a generic enemy uniform. This triggers a broad local defense, including making antimicrobial chemicals called phytoalexins.
But some pathogens have evolved to get around that.
They have. They use proteins called effectors to disable PTI. So the plant evolved a second line of defense, effector-triggered immunity, or ETI.
This sounds more specific.
It's highly specific. It relies on R proteins. If a plant's R protein recognizes a specific pathogen effector, it unleashes a much more powerful and targeted response.
A hypersensitive response.
Yes, and it sounds extreme, but it's incredibly effective.
So what happens?
The plant cells right around the point of infection are triggered to undergo programmed cell death. They basically commit suicide.
Whoa. It sacrifices its own tissue.
It does. It creates a dead zone, a lesion, that seals off the pathogen, starves it, and prevents it from spreading. It's a localized firewall.
And that local battle sends out a warning to the rest of the plant.
It does. That's systemic acquired resistance, or SAR. The infected area produces a chemical signal that travels through the phloem and puts the entire plant on high alert, making it resistant to future attacks for days or even weeks.
Now, what about bigger enemies, like herbivores?
Well, you have physical defenses like thorns, but some of the chemical and cellular ones are amazing. Some plants make cells called idioblasts that are packed with these needle-sharp crystals of calcium oxalate.
Ouch.
Yeah, as an animal chews, these crystals act like tiny hypodermic needles, helping inject irritating chemicals from the plant directly into the herbivore's mouth.
But the coolest defense has to be recruiting predators.
Oh, it's the best. So a caterpillar starts chewing on a leaf. The plant detects chemicals in the caterpillar's saliva. In response, it releases a specific blend of volatile chemicals into the air.
A perfume.
A perfume that acts as a beacon, specifically attracting parasitic wasps that then come and lay their eggs inside the caterpillar.
The plant is literally calling in an airstrike, using the attacker's own saliva as the trigger. That's incredible.
It's biological warfare at its finest.
So we've gone from a single cell detecting light to hormones coordinating the whole organism to these complex defense strategies. But it all comes back to that core idea.
Reception, transduction, and response.
Exactly. And we saw how that phytochrome switch and the critical night length lets plants keep time to make sure they flower at the absolute best moment.
It's all just layers and layers of sophisticated control.
So here's the final thought I want to leave you with. We established that auxin makes stems grow longer. But we also said that high concentrations of auxin trigger ethylene, and ethylene stops the stem from elongating as part of the triple response. So you have this built-in conflict. How does the plant weigh those competing signals? The long-term goal of growing tall versus the immediate critical need to avoid a rock.
It's a great question. It forces you to see that a plant's life isn't just a simple program. It's a constant dynamic negotiation between dozens of internal signals and a world that is always changing.
A negotiation we just got a fantastic shortcut to understanding. Thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive.